The Formation of Rwanda, Part 1. The Kingdom of Rwanda. The Rise of a Centralized State. Rwanda, a land of rolling green hills, mist-covered valleys, and a history as deep as the lakes that dot its landscape. If you could travel back in time, thousands of years before the world knew Rwanda as a nation, you'd find a place rich with life. Imagine it, small communities of hunter-gatherers navigating the forests, living in harmony with the land. Over time, waves of Bantu-speaking farmers arrived, bringing with them iron tools, livestock, and the foundations of what would become one of Africa's most centralized and enduring kingdoms. By around the 11th or 12th century, a new political structure was emerging in the region. Unlike many African societies, which were organized around loose clans or chiefdoms, Rwanda began to develop a centralized monarchy, a system where power was concentrated under a single ruler. This wasn't just any kingdom. This was a society built on a sophisticated structure of social hierarchy, governance, and military strength. At the heart of it all was the Mwami, the king. He was no mere ruler. He was seen as a divine figure, the chosen one, responsible for the well-being of the land and its people. Imagine the Mwami seated in a grand court, surrounded by advisors, warriors, and elders, making decisions that would shape the fate of an entire nation. It wasn't just power, it was destiny. Now, Rwanda's society was built on three main groups: Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. But, here's where things get interesting. Unlike the rigid racial or ethnic labels we think of today, these groups were originally more fluid. The Hutu were mostly farmers, tending to the land, growing crops like bananas and sorghum. The Tutsi were cattle herders, their wealth measured by the size of their herds. And the Twa, a much smaller group, were hunter-gatherers, living on the fringes of society. But, and this is important, these groups weren't entirely separate. Intermarriage happened, and people could move between them based on wealth and status. A Hutu who gained cattle could rise to become a Tutsi. Social mobility existed, but it was about to change. By the 16th century, the Kingdom of Rwanda had become one of the most powerful states in East Africa. Under rulers like Mwami Ruganzu Ndori, the kingdom expanded its borders, conquering neighboring regions and absorbing smaller chiefdoms. Picture armies of Rwandan warriors moving through the hills, carrying long spears, their shields gleaming in the sunlight as they advanced. Warfare wasn't just about conquest. It was about solidifying the kingdom's power and bringing order to a fragmented land. And then came the 19th century, when Rwanda reached the height of its power. The kingdom was a well-oiled machine. Taxes were collected in cattle and goods, and the military was tightly organized. The Mwami ruled with absolute authority, backed by a network of chiefs who oversaw the land, the people, and, well, everything. But, there was something else, something that was starting to take root. Over time, the lines between Hutu and Tutsi had begun to harden. The ruling class, made up mostly of Tutsi elites, consolidated power, creating a system that placed the Hutu population at a disadvantage. A social divide was forming, one that would be exploited in the years to come. As we leave this chapter, Rwanda stands as a strong, centralized kingdom, a beacon of order in a region often plagued by instability. But this balance is fragile. Change is coming, foreign powers are watching, and soon European colonialists will arrive, bringing with them new ideas, new rulers, and a legacy that will reshape Rwanda forever. Stay with me, because wow, the next part of this story, it's about to take a turn. The Formation of Rwanda, Part 2. Colonial rule, divide and conquer under Germany and Belgium. The late 19th century, a time of exploration, conquest, and, well, greed. Across Africa, European powers were scrambling for land, carving up entire civilizations like pieces of a pie at the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884-1885. And Rwanda? It was on the menu. At first, European explorers arrived with curiosity. Richard Kant, a German colonial administrator, was among the first Westerners to truly document Rwanda. But, let's not be naive. The Germans weren't here just to admire the rolling hills and the beauty of Lake Kivu. They saw opportunity. By 1897, Rwanda was officially absorbed into German East Africa, though, interestingly, Germany never fully occupied it. Unlike other colonies where Europeans ruled with direct force, the Germans decided to govern through the existing Rwandan monarchy. It was a clever move. Instead of dismantling the system, they co-opted it, strengthening the Mwami's power, but reshaping the hierarchy to fit their colonial vision. And here's where things start to take a dark turn. Remember how Hutu and Tutsi identities had once been flexible? That fluidity, that ability to move up or down based on wealth, began to disappear under German rule. The Germans believed in a racial hierarchy, and to them the Tutsi ruling class looked more noble, taller, leaner, more refined, at least by their racist pseudo-scientific standards. So they elevated the Tutsi elite even further, placing them in exclusive positions of power while systematically excluding the Hutu majority. This wasn't just a social change, it was a complete restructuring of power. Hutu chiefs were removed, and Tutsi leaders, who had once ruled alongside Hutu counterparts, were given total authority under German oversight. Rwanda was becoming something it had never been before, a rigid, racially stratified society where one group held complete dominance over another. Then, in 1916, the Germans were forced to retreat. World War I was raging, and Belgium seized control of Rwanda from them. At first, people might have thought, maybe things will be different under Belgian rule. But wow, if anything, it got worse. The Belgians took the German strategy and supercharged it. They didn't just favor the Tutsi elite. They institutionalized the divide. They introduced identity cards in 1933, literally labeling every Rwandan as either Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa. Imagine that. Suddenly, what had once been a flexible social distinction was now a fixed, unchangeable identity. If you were Hutu, you would always be Hutu. If you were Tutsi, you had privileges, power, and access. The divide and rule policy was now set in stone, and the exploitation didn't stop there. The Belgians imposed harsh labor policies, forcing Hutu farmers to work under Tutsi chiefs in a brutal system of taxation and forced labor. It was, let's be honest, a return to feudalism, except now it was backed by European guns, laws, and whips. Tensions were rising. Imagine a young Hutu farmer in the 1940s, his hands blistered from forced labor, watching as Tutsi elites, now educated in Belgian-run schools, trained in European customs, held all the power. The resentment was growing. The system was unsustainable. And then, in 1959, something snapped. By this time, waves of anti-colonial movements were sweeping across Africa, and Rwanda was no exception. Hutu leaders, fed up with years of oppression, began organizing, demanding equal rights and an end to Tutsi dominance. The Belgians, sensing trouble, did something shocking. They switched sides. Yes, the same Belgians who had spent decades propping up Tutsi elites suddenly began supporting the Hutu majority. They saw that the winds of independence were coming, and they didn't want to be on the losing side. So they flipped the system, Tutsi leaders were removed, and Hutu politicians began taking their place. By 1961, the monarchy, the same Rwandan kingship that had ruled for centuries, was abolished. Rwanda was on the brink of independence, but the deep wounds left by colonialism, division, and decades of European interference would not heal so easily. As we leave this chapter, Rwanda stands at a crossroads. The Belgians are leaving. The Hutu majority is rising to power. The Tutsi elite, once favored, now find themselves on the losing end. But what happens when the oppressed become the oppressors? And is there any way to prevent the violence that is, clearly brewing just beneath the surface? Stay with me, because wow, in the next part, things are about to explode. The Formation of Rwanda, Part 3, Independence and Political Upheaval, The Road to Ethnic Division. 1962, a year of liberation, of change, of hope. Rwanda, after decades under Belgian rule, finally became independent. The flags were raised, the people cheered, and a new nation was born. But here's the thing about independence. Freedom from colonial rule doesn't erase the wounds left behind. And in Rwanda's case, those wounds were deep. Let's rewind for a second. The Belgians, in their final years of control, had done something incredibly destructive. They had reversed the power structure. After decades of backing the Tutsi elite, they suddenly switched sides, empowering the Hutu majority. And wow, that shift came with violence. In 1959, 3 years before independence, a Hutu uprising erupted. Tutsi leaders were overthrown, their homes were burned, and many were killed or forced to flee. Imagine the panic, families abandoning everything, crossing the borders into Uganda, Burundi, Tanzania, and the Congo, seeking safety. This was the beginning of the Rwandan refugee crisis, a crisis that would shape the country's future in ways no one could have predicted. By 1961, the centuries-old monarchy was gone. The last king, Kigeli Ndahindurwa, fled into exile, and Rwanda was officially declared a republic. Now picture this, a country where the former ruling class was now in exile, watching from afar as the Hutu-led government took control. Can you feel the tension? The first Hutu president, Gregoire Kayibanda, took office in 1962, and his government was built on Hutu nationalism. To many, this was justice. After all, hadn't the Hutu people suffered under Tutsi rule for centuries? But justice quickly turned into revenge. Kayibanda's administration launched policies that systematically excluded Tutsis from power. Tutsi elites, once the favored ruling class, were now treated as second-class citizens. Jobs, education, government positions all prioritized Hutus. The message was clear. This was their time to rule. And, the violence didn't stop. Between 1959 and 1973, waves of massacres targeted Tutsi communities. Thousands were killed. Hundreds of thousands were still in exile, forming a growing diaspora in neighboring countries. And within those refugee communities, the seeds of resistance were beginning to grow. Now, let's talk about the early 1970s, because, wow, things took another turn. In 1973, Rwanda's second coup overthrew Kayibanda, replacing him with Juvenal Habyarimana, a military officer with a very different vision. Habyarimana promised stability. He wanted to unify Rwanda, to end the cycles of violence that had plagued the country since independence. And for a while, it seemed like he did. His rule was, calm, at least on the surface. But let's be honest, calm does not mean peace. Under Habyarimana, the discrimination against Tutsis became official policy. They were still barred from high government positions. Their movements were restricted. Many were treated as foreigners in their own land. Meanwhile, across the border in Uganda, something else was happening. Something that would change Rwanda forever. Among the Tutsi refugees living in exile, a young generation had grown up without a home, without citizenship, without rights. And they were angry. They had watched their parents suffer, their people massacred, their homeland slip further and further from reach. And in the late 1980s, they decided enough was enough. Enter the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, a rebel group formed by Tutsi exiles determined to reclaim their country. Many of them had fought alongside Yoweri Museveni in Uganda's guerrilla war, helping him seize power in 1986. And once Museveni became president of Uganda, well, he didn't exactly stop them from organizing. In 1990, the RPF launched an invasion into Rwanda, aiming to topple Habyarimana's government. Imagine it. Gunfire at the border, soldiers pouring in, the government scrambling to respond. It was the beginning of a civil war. Habyarimana, desperate to hold on to power, played the ethnic card hard. His government launched an anti-Tutsi propaganda campaign, filling the radio waves with warnings that the Tutsi were traitors, invaders, enemies of Rwanda. Posters, speech, news reports, it all painted Tutsis, even those who had never left the country, as an existential threat. Wow. Looking back, it's chilling, because this wasn't just political rhetoric. It was fuel for something much worse. For the next 3 years, the war between the RPF rebels and Habyarimana's government raged on. Meanwhile, Hutu militias, some trained and armed by the government, were being organized in the background. Then came 1993 and, maybe, just maybe, there was a glimmer of hope. International pressure forced Habyarimana to sign the Arusha Accords, a peace agreement that promised to integrate the RPF into the government and bring an end to the war. Diplomats cheered. The world thought finally Rwanda might find peace. But inside Rwanda, inside the government, inside the Hutu extremist circles, They saw the peace deal as a betrayal, and so they began preparing Plan B. As we leave this chapter, the tension in Rwanda is unbearable. The government is crumbling, the extremists are plotting, the RPF is waiting for its moment. And then April 1994, one event will ignite a 100-day nightmare that the world will never forget. Stay with me, because, the next part, it's one of the darkest chapters in human history. The Formation of Rwanda, Part 4, The Rwandan Genocide, 100 Days of Horror. April 6, 1994, a day that would plunge Rwanda into hell on earth. The world barely noticed at first. It was just another evening in Kigali, the capital, where tensions had been simmering for years. But as the sun set that night, something happened that would ignite a 100-day nightmare. A plane carrying President Juvenal Habyarimana and the President of Burundi, Cyprien Taryamira, was approaching Kigali airport. Suddenly from the ground, 2 missiles streaked through the sky. In seconds, the aircraft exploded into a fireball, crashing just outside the capital. No one survived. And in that moment, Rwanda erupted. Now let's pause for a second. Who fired the missiles? To this day, the truth is, murky. The Hutu-led government immediately blamed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, the Tutsi rebel group fighting for power. The RPF denied it and pointed the finger back at Hutu extremists, suggesting they orchestrated the attack as an excuse to unleash their long-planned massacre. Whatever the truth, within hours the killing had begun. That night, roadblocks went up all over Kigali. Armed men with machetes, rifles and clubs stopped cars, demanding to see identification. If you had a Tutsi ID card, you were dead. If you were a Hutu suspected of sympathizing with the Tutsi, also dead. The violence spread like wildfire, not just in the capital, but in towns and villages across the country. It wasn't just the military. Ordinary civilians, neighbors, co-workers, even friends became killers. The genocide wasn't random. No, it was systematic, planned, and brutally efficient. Radio stations, especially the infamous Radio Television Libre de Milcar TLM, broadcast messages telling Hutus to rise up and exterminate the Tutsi cockroaches. They listed names, gave addresses, and encouraged people to kill their neighbors. And then came the Interahamwe, the Hutu militia. They hunted down Tutsis in homes, churches, schools, and hospitals. Now, imagine this, entire families butchered in broad daylight. Parents forced to watch their children murdered before they themselves were slaughtered. Women and girls raped by the thousands, often by men infected with HIV, a deliberate weapon of war. The killers weren't using guns. They were using machetes, clubs, spears, even farming tools. No one was spared. Not women, not children, not the elderly. The rivers, bodies were dumped into the Kagera River, which flows into Lake Victoria. Within days, corpses began washing up on the shores of Uganda and Tanzania. The stench of death filled the air. And the world? The world watched and did nothing. The United Nations had peacekeepers in Rwanda, UNAMIR, led by Canadian General Romeo Dallaire. Before the genocide, Dallaire had warned the UN that something horrific was being planned. He even had a defector, a Hutu insider, who revealed the extremists' intentions to exterminate Tutsis. And yet, what did the UN do? They refused to act. They told Dallaire he had no authority to intervene. When the killing began, instead of sending reinforcements, the UN withdrew most of its troops, leaving Rwanda to its fate. The United States? Silent. France? They had trained some of the genocidal government forces. The international community? They called it ethnic conflict, avoiding the word genocide, because legally, if they admitted it was genocide, they would be obligated to intervene. So, Rwanda burned, and the slaughter continued. By June 1994, an estimated 800,000 to 1 million people had been massacred in just 100 days. That's 10,000 people per day. Imagine that. Every single day, more people murdered than in the entire 9/11 attacks. But then the tide turned. While the international community did nothing, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, led by Paul Kagame, launched a final military offensive. They swept through the country, pushing back the Hutu government forces and militia. By mid-July, Kigali fell. The genocide was over. But wow, what was left? Rwanda was in ruins. The killers? Some had been captured, but most had fled across the borders into Zaire, now the DRC, Tanzania, and Burundi. The Tutsi survivors? They were traumatized, broken, and orphaned. Entire families were gone. The country was a graveyard. As we leave this chapter, Rwanda is standing at the edge of an abyss. The genocide is over. But how do you recover from something like this? How do you rebuild a nation where the killers and survivors must now live side by side? And what happens when the genocide's masterminds regroup in exile, still armed, still waiting for revenge? Stay with me, because in the next part, Rwanda begins the impossible task of rebuilding from the ashes. The Formation of Rwanda, Part 5, Post-Genocide, Rwanda, Justice, Reconciliation and Reconstruction. Rwanda was a nation of ghosts. The genocide was over, but what was left? Entire villages emptied, streets filled with abandoned corpses, families wiped out. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the soil? It had soaked up so much blood, it seemed to whisper the names of the lost. Paul Kagame and the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, had seized control, but what they inherited wasn't a country, it was a graveyard. And where do you even begin to rebuild when over 1 million people are dead and nearly 2 million more are on the run, hiding in refugee camps in neighboring Zaire, now the DRC, Tanzania, Burundi and Uganda? And let's talk about those refugee camps, because, wow, they weren't just filled with survivors. No, many of the killers, genocidaires, the masterminds of the slaughter, had also fled. In the chaos of the war's end, entire groups of Interahamwe militia, Hutu government soldiers, and former officials had escaped across the borders. And they weren't just sitting around. Oh no, they were rearming, reorganizing, and preparing for revenge. Meanwhile, inside Rwanda, the survivors were left with an impossible reality. The very people who had murdered their families were still right there, walking the same streets, shopping in the same markets. The genocide had ended. But the wounds? Oh, they were wide open. Now, how do you even deliver justice after a genocide? There were, quite literally, too many killers to imprison. The entire judicial system had collapsed. Judges, lawyers, and police officers had either been murdered or had fled. Rwanda had hundreds of thousands of suspects, but no way to process trials quickly. At first, international courts stepped in. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, established by the United Nations in 1995, aimed to prosecute the highest-ranking genocidaires, the planners, the masterminds, the ones who had used radio, newspapers, and propaganda to fuel the killings. Some were captured, tried, and sentenced. But, justice at this level was slow. Cases dragged on for years, and the tribunal's reach was limited. Inside Rwanda, Kagame and the new government knew they needed something different. So they revived an old tradition, the Gakaka courts. Gakaka, meaning grass courts, was a traditional Rwandan justice system where local communities would gather and hold public trials. The idea? Instead of locking everyone away, the killers had to face their neighbors, confess their crimes, and ask for forgiveness. And wow, imagine that moment! Imagine being a survivor, sitting in the sun, looking across at the man who murdered your family, listening as he describes in brutal detail what he did. Can you forgive? Do you even want to? The Gakaka courts weren't perfect. Some killers lied, some escaped accountability, and for many, forgiveness wasn't possible. But still, it was a start. Over 1.9 million cases were processed in these courts, one of the most ambitious post-genocide justice efforts ever attempted. Now let's talk about Paul Kagame, because wow, his leadership changed everything. After the genocide, Rwanda was on the brink of collapse, but Kagame was determined to rebuild. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a strategist, a man who understood that if Rwanda was to survive, it had to be reborn completely. First, he focused on economic growth, and it worked. Within 2 decades, Rwanda transformed into one of Africa's fastest-growing economies. Roads were rebuilt, schools and hospitals were constructed, foreign investors poured in. Kagame promoted technology, infrastructure and entrepreneurship, branding Rwanda as the Singapore of Africa, efficient, modern and, totally different from its past. But yes, there's always a but. This came at a cost. Kagame ruled with an iron grip. There was no room for dissent. Opposition leaders were jailed, exiled or worse. The press, tightly controlled. Rwanda was safe, but it was also a country where speaking out against the government could be dangerous. And let's talk about Rwanda's involvement in the Congo Wars, because wow, this is where things get messy. After the genocide, millions of Hutu refugees, including the genocidaires, had fled into Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. But they weren't just hiding, they were launching attacks on Rwanda. Kagame's government wasn't having it. In 1996, Rwandan forces invaded Zaire, hunting down the genocidaires deep inside Congolese territory. This war, it spiraled out of control. Rwanda wasn't just fighting Hutu rebels anymore. They ended up toppling the entire Zairian government, installing a new leader, Laurent Désiré Kabila, and triggering a multi-nation war that would become known as Africa's First World War. Millions died. The war in Congo was brutal, and Rwanda, once the victim of genocide, became embroiled in accusations of war crimes, massacres, and resource exploitation. Kagame's Rwanda wasn't just defending itself, it was now a regional power, shaping politics far beyond its borders. Despite all of this, despite the genocide, the war, the trauma, Rwanda has somehow rebuilt itself. It's now one of the safest and cleanest countries in Africa. The economy is booming, and Kigali, its capital, looks unrecognizable from the city that burned in 1994. Rwanda has pushed a national reconciliation program where Tutsis and Hutus live side by side, even after everything that happened. But can a country ever truly heal from something like this? Can you ever erase the scars of a genocide? As we leave this chapter, Rwanda stands as a paradox. It is one of Africa's greatest success stories, and yet it is still haunted by its past. Kagame is praised as a visionary and condemned as a dictator. The country is thriving, but freedom of speech is fragile. And the question remains, is Rwanda's peace built on true reconciliation? Or is it a delicate balance that could still collapse under the weight of its own history? Stay with me because, in the final part we'll explore modern Rwanda, its role on the global stage, and what the future holds for this extraordinary nation. The Formation of Rwanda, Part 6. Rwanda Today, a nation rebuilt, but at what cost? It's been 3 decades since the genocide, and if you were to visit Rwanda today, you might not believe what you see. Kigali, once the heart of so much horror, now stands as one of the cleanest, safest and fastest-growing capitals in Africa. Towering skyscrapers, gleaming roads, tech hubs, bustling markets. It's a country that, on the surface, seems to have completely transformed. But underneath the progress, beneath the shining exterior, the weight of history still lingers. Paul Kagame remains at the helm, the man who led the Rwandan Patriotic Front to victory in 1994, the man who promised to never let the country collapse again. To his supporters, he is a visionary leader, the reason Rwanda has become an economic powerhouse. To his critics, he is a ruthless autocrat. A man who has silenced opposition, crushed dissent, and extended his presidency through constitutional changes. And yet, here's the thing. Rwanda works. There's an undeniable order to the country. The streets are pristine, crime is shockingly low, and the economy is one of the fastest growing in Africa. Foreign investment has poured in, tourism is booming, and Rwanda is now known as the Singapore of Africa, efficient, modern, disciplined. But, let's talk about the trade-offs. There is no space for political opposition in Kagame's Rwanda. Opposition leaders have been jailed, exiled, or even assassinated under suspicious circumstances. Journalists who criticize the government, they often disappear or are forced to flee. The government has tight control over the press, and Kagame's party, the RPF, dominates every level of power. And yet, many Rwandans, especially the younger generation, are willing to accept this bargain. After all, compared to the chaos of 1994, life in Kagame's Rwanda is stable, peaceful, and prosperous. The international community, too, has had mixed reactions to Kagame's rule. Some hail him as a model African leader, a man who has turned Rwanda into a success story. Others warn that his authoritarian grip is dangerous, that beneath the surface, tensions could still explode. And then, of course, there's Rwanda's role in the ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. For years, Rwanda has been accused of supporting rebel groups inside the DRC, using them to control valuable mineral resources. Kagame denies it, but reports suggest that Rwandan-backed militias have committed atrocities in eastern Congo, a region that has been plagued by war since the 1990s. This has led to diplomatic tensions, with Rwanda often being accused of playing a double game, projecting stability at home while fueling conflict next door. But inside Rwanda, the past is never far away. The government has worked tirelessly to promote reconciliation between Hutus and Tutsis, but can a nation ever truly heal from a genocide of this scale? Rwandans are expected to avoid ethnic labels. In official discourse, everyone is just Rwandan now. No more Hutu, no more Tutsi. There are memorials and annual remembrances, but public discussions about ethnicity? Strictly controlled. For some, this enforced silence is necessary. It keeps Rwanda from sliding back into division. For others, it's dangerous, because unspoken tensions can still grow beneath the surface. And then there's the next big question. What happens when Kagame is no longer in power? He has already extended his rule through constitutional referendums, allowing him to remain president until at least 2034. But what happens after that? Kagame is a strongman leader, and strongman governments often crumble when their leader is gone. Will Rwanda's stability last beyond him, or is it being held together by his personal control? As we wrap up this journey, Rwanda stands as a paradox. It is one of Africa's greatest success stories, and yet it is still haunted by its past. It is a country of progress, but also of deep political repression, a place of hope, but also of unanswered questions. The world looks at Rwanda and asks, has it truly healed, or has it simply learned to suppress its wounds? And Rwanda itself must ask, what comes next?